Alrighty. Well, I'm thinking other people will roll in. I feel like everyone, including this computer, are just moving slower today because break's about to start. So we'll go ahead and dive in. I did finally figure out what the heck is happening to my YouTube videos, which is we are under the educational version of Google Suite. And apparently it will block any videos that are essentially not explicitly G-rated. And so like a lot of these academic ones don't have any rating on it. So I've been going through, I also figured out how to find the source code so I can find the links. It's, y'all, like I'm not a hacker, right? But like this is what I'm having to do. So I should have the updated videos now. And you know, it's always an adventure. We do what we can. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen for the folks online. And we'll dive back in here to what we were talking about on Monday. And so we watched the one about alien abductions, but I also have one about vampires. So I'm going to go ahead and open that one. And like
Vampires have earned their place in horror history, but
you will
many people
see
may
if it'll pause. There we go. That vampires have in fact been a thing in the past, although not in the way we traditionally think about them.
not know that in some cases, vampires are more than just works of fiction. Some famous vampire stories have actually come from real events, and that's what we're going to be bringing you in today's It's All Viral video. These are our picks for the top 5 real-life vampires. Number 5. The Vampires of New England. Starting off our list is a fairly recent event taking place in the United States. In New England in 1990, a grave was discovered, containing the bodies of farmers who died in the 1700s. However, upon investigation of the corpses, one body had been rearranged in the shape of a Jolly Roger. Someone had broken into the coffin years after the deaths and rearranged the body. This discovery was soon linked to the Jewett City vampires of the 1800s. Investigator Michael Bell believes that there is plenty more to learn about these vampires. Number 4. Sava Savanović. Now, while some of you may recognize this name from the ghost vampire of the same name in Serbian folklore, you may not know that this story came from nonfiction. In the 1600s, Savanović was said to have lived in an old mill and would kill and feast on unsuspecting travelers. After his passing, his mill was passed on from generation to generation, each new owner too scared to make any changes to the structure in fear of upsetting Sava. Because of its lack of refurbishment, the mill collapsed in 2012, leading many locals to believe Savanović's ghost is now searching for a new home. Number 3. The Highgate Vampire. Another relatively recent event on our list, this story comes from Highgate Cemetery in London in 1969. Animal corpses began appearing in the cemetery, inexplicably drained of their blood. As locals began to investigate the cause of this phenomenon, many began to report a tall figure lurking around the cemetery at night. After these stories hit the press, a group of vampire hunters began digging up the graves in search of him, and soon the vampire stopped appearing. So, was he caught, or did he simply move on to another hunting ground?
Or did he
Number 2.
never exist?
Đuro Grando. A Croatian peasant who died in 1656, Đuro Grando is the earliest recorded example of a vampire. According to locals, every night for 16 years after his death, he would knock on people's doors, marking anyone inside for death within the coming days. After years of being terrorized by Grando, a priest and a group of peasants stood up to the spirit, chasing him back to his grave and decapitating his corpse, putting an end to his reign. Grando is the first recorded example of a vampire in history, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. And finally, number 1. Elizabeth Bathory. Known as the Blood Countess, and for good reason, Elizabeth Bathory was a Romanian countess who ruled in the 16th century and had a disturbing fascination with torturing her subjects. Her methods range from forced body piercings to standing someone out in the snow until they froze to death. So, what makes her a vampire? Well, she had a habit of bathing in the blood of her victims in an effort to keep herself from aging. After being put on trial, Bathory was walled inside her castle until she eventually died. But her legacy and perhaps her ghost still live on. But alright, there we go, guys.
So again, I think it's good to look at where do some of these ideas that, we would probably all acknowledge are, fun around Halloween, but not probable come from. And they come from stuff like this, right? They come from various stories and things about people who were engaged in some sort of blood ritual and then they became a vampire.
Thanks to curiosity.
And so kind of circling back to correlation and causation here. And we tend to think if things are associated, one must cause the other. But it's almost never just one thing, right? And in fact, we can really mess ourselves up by that. So again, another quick video here.
Though deeply rooted in our evolutionary history, has to be one of the most destructive of human behaviors. For years, researchers have tried to understand what drives us to commit acts of violence. Is it the environment we were raised in? The socio-economic situation we find ourselves in? Or is it driven by something completely different? Something we have no control of? Our genes? Or specifically, the so-called warrior gene? The story of the warrior gene starts in 1978, when a woman walked into a hospital in the Netherlands, and not because she was worried about herself, but because she was worried about her family. All the men in the family had a history of really terrible violent crimes. There were murders, there were rapes, going back generations and generations. Researchers started gathering DNA samples from the members of her family, and they discovered that all the men who had this history of very violent crime, they had the same genetic change in a gene called MAOA, or monoamine oxidase A, that completely knocked out the function of the gene. It wasn't working at all. We all have 2 copies of this warrior gene. It makes a molecule in your brain that breaks down a chemical called serotonin. This is a neurotransmitter. It sends signals between the cells in your brain and affects your behavior.
And this is why some of the antidepressants are MAOIs or inhibitors for this particular neurochemical.
So if this gene isn't working as well as it could do, it's thought that perhaps it makes you more impulsive, it makes it harder to control urges. So the Dutch study was the first time that this gene, MAOA, had been linked to violent behaviour. But then a study in New Zealand took this further. The Dunedin study followed 1,000 New Zealanders for decades, looking for connections between childhood experiences and violent behaviour later in life. They found that having a variation that just lowers the level of activity of this gene, not knocks it out completely, but just lowers the activity, was associated with a history of violence. But curiously, mostly only in people who also had a very difficult childhood as well. And that caught the eye of researchers in Finland, working with prisoners in a very high security prison.
We collected a cohort of around 800 prisoners, and about 2/3 of them had conducted at least one violent crime. About a little bit more than 10% or 15% had committed at least 10 violent crimes: murders, attempted murders, manslaughters. I was skeptical, but what we did find was indeed, if an individual had 2 or more violent crimes, then he or she had significantly more of the low activity MAOA.
We know that up to 6 in 10 people are walking around with the low activity version of MAOA, but of course 6 out of 10 people don't commit horrific violent crimes. So obviously we can't say that if you've got this gene variation, you are going to be a violent criminal. Genetics doesn't.
And I think that's a really important point. I think it's really easy, and you hear this a lot in our culture now, that like to say, oh, there's a gene that causes this, therefore, or there's a gene that's related to this, therefore it's caused by genetics. But in fact, as she's pointing out, it's much more complicated. And the best way to think about it is that genes are expressed in an environment, right? So if you have this gene for violence, but you have a great childhood and adulthood and you never have any call for violence, it's probably never going to be expressed. And it's really hard to kind of think about and wrap your head around it, but we can think about it in terms of physical genes as well. Let's say you have the genetics to be 6'5", right? But you are nutritionally deprived your entire childhood. You might never reach that genetic potential, right? Because of your environment. And so it's showing that even genetics, which we tend to think is very cut and dry, is not.
Doesn't really work like that. But this idea that there's a gene behind violent behaviour, could you use that as a defence in court? You know, it wasn't me, Gov, it was my genes that made me do it. Well, it might sound a bit strange, but that is actually what's happening.
It's only really been used in two countries, two in an Italian court and the rest have been in American courts. It's been used as a way of saying that the person lacked control. I think it's the sort of evidence that is attempting to be used to dazzle a jury.
In the
And this is really important because depending on your jurisdiction, the sort of states or the statute that says whether or not you're considered not guilty by reason of insanity might include whether or not you can control yourself. Yeah. Yeah, so sometimes you'll hear it referred to as that as well, right? Exactly, yeah. So people are like, oh, so a lot of serial killers have this gene, therefore, if you have this gene, you're going to become a serial killer. And again, that's sort of like weird circular logic. That's not always the case, right? Like you could have the genetic potential to be Ted Bundy, but if your life goes pretty well, that's probably not going to happen, right? It's sort of interesting to think about in that way. Yeah.
US, where you have the death penalty for these kinds of incredibly violent crimes, the stakes are obviously literally life and death. So lawyers will try and introduce any kind of evidence they can to argue against the death penalty for their client.
To say that there is a gene, like a time bomb that none of us are aware of, I think is wishful thinking.
So humans carry different versions of the MAOA gene, and those that reduce the activity of this gene have been linked to increased risk of aggressive behavior.
And that's something else to like keep in mind as we think about genetics, is it's not just you have a gene or a not, right? We all have this gene, it's just which variant of it we have.
Some studies also suggest a link between an abusive childhood, the MAOA gene not functioning adequately, and an increased risk of developing antisocial personality disorder, which may result in committing violent criminal acts.
An antisocial personality disorder is what in layman's term we would call psychopathy or sociopathy. So yeah, going back to serial killers, right?
But whilst it can be tempting to paint a simple picture of how genetics influence our behaviour, in reality, it's an incredibly complex issue.
Everything that happens to us interacts with our genes and influences who we are and how we behave. The fact that we can find a connection between genes and violent behaviour doesn't mean that we're going to be heading towards some terrible genetic dystopia where little Johnny is locked up because he's got bad genes that might make him do bad things. That simply isn't how genetics work.
I mean, it's not Minority Report, right? And also, as she's pointing out, genetics are very complex. So even though we've recognized that this one particular gene is showing influence, right, on some behavior, there are probably 3 or 4 other genes that are also implicated in violent behavior, right? And you would need a combination of those. So we know that within any question, any data we collect, there's going to be some uncertainty, right? And so one of the ways that people try to explain this or wrap their head around it is the law of inevitability. The idea that something has to happen. And sometimes that something is like it not happening. So out of all of the possible random outcomes that could occur, at least one will. So we see this, when the Powerball or the Mega Millions get up really high, right? People will be like, oh, someone has to win, right? Because it's so high. And then no one does, right? And so then it goes up again. And it's again, really related to probability. And people also have a lot more in common than we think. So for example, there are these news stories. If you Google like twins separated at birth, where we'll talk about like when they met each other, they were both wearing a rubber band on their right wrist, and they both like this brand of cigarettes. In my theories of personality class, I do an activity where I have people and they're supposed to pair up with someone they don't even know. Pair up with somebody and just go through a list and see how many things they have in common. And typically, even for people who are, I just like, based on my understanding of their personalities, are very different, will come up with anywhere from 15 to 30 of these things that they're have in common, right? And so we can't just attribute everything to genetics. Probabilities are also weird, and this video will tell us a little
And
bit
then
about
I
that.
switched to Liberty Mutual and saved hundreds.
Once we get past the Liberty Mutual video.
New Zero to Brow 2-Day Longwear Brow Gel.
There. Obviously, this was made before 2020, right? We had other things happen in 2020. We didn't need the solar flare taking out the power grid, right? And like, to me, when we look at this one of like having a family who has an income of 35K or less, you have a bigger chance of having an ulcer. Like, we know that ulcers are related to stress, right? And poverty is related to stress. And not that 35K is poverty per se, but depending on where you live and the cost of living, it can be pretty darn close, right? So less of a chance, but still a chance. Like, that's probably a lot more frequently than we think, right? And there's a whole bunch of these, and we don't have to sit and listen to the eerie music the whole time, right? But just to give you the idea that like we'll hear these statistics all the time of like, oh, there's a 1 in 100 chance that you'll be born with blah blah blah. And like there's a lot more stuff out there that just like isn't a catchy statistic. And so we know that there's error in measurement. I'm going to go back to the other slide in just a sec. And we've talked about this before. So, right, even the best measures have error. So if we think about, let's say, a ruler, which we tend to think is a pretty standard measurement tool, when could a ruler be inaccurate? I'm talking about like the 12-inch thing, not like a queen or a king. They can be inaccurate a lot, right? But what are instances where your ruler might not actually be measuring what you think it's measuring? Let's get an example. What if it was made of wood? What could happen there? Well, we know that wood can expand or shrink with temperature, often infinitesimally, right? But this is why a lot of times as the temperature change, like doors might be more or less sticky that are made of wood, right? If it gets warped because of water damage, same thing. A metal ruler can end up curving, right? Things along those lines. So accuracy is something we need to keep in mind, which is the degree to which a measure reflects the true value of the variable measured. Precision, on the other hand, is the exactness of a measure. So they give some good examples. So it's precise to say the temperature is 98 degrees, but it's also accurate to say it's hot, right? And like, do you really need to know it's 98 to know it's hot? But precision can be accurate to say it's afternoon, but it's not as precise as saying the exact time. And then reliability is the consistency of a measurement tool or the data collected on more than one occasion. So we hope that that ruler is reliable. We hope that if we're using a questionnaire, it's reliable. And there are always uncertainties, and statistics try to help us quantify that and acknowledge that that error exists, that lack of precision, that lack of accuracy. It helps us try to make the best prediction possible. And we don't always do that, right?
There are many.
Just gonna mute during the ads here. So a lot of people have loved Dr. Oz, right? Oprah gave him to us like she gave us Dr. Phil. But he has some.
He may be a surgeon. He may reach more people in an hour than most doctors treat in their lifetimes. But it's no secret that TV star Dr. Oz doesn't exactly prioritize evidence-based health advice, especially when it comes to weight loss. He was even called before a Senate subcommittee recently to explain,
I don't get why you need to say this stuff because you know it's not true.
Dr. Oz once told me in an interview that if he didn't have the glitzy stuff, nobody would watch his show. The trouble is, viewers get common sense advice along with a big dose of nonsense. It can be hard to tell the difference. Here are 3 of Dr. Oz's biggest weight loss lies to watch out for. Number 1. So on the show, Dr. Oz...
And again, like, we're thinking this guy's a medical doctor, right? We should be able to trust him. And like, he's prioritizing weight loss. So therefore, we should prioritize weight loss. And this is going to point out not only that these individual weight loss things he promotes are problematic, but also, again, just as someone who studies eating and disordered eating, like, weight loss is not always a goal we want to even strive to achieve, right? Depending on health factors.
Oz often likes to claim metabolism boosters are the holy grails of weight loss.
Behind these walls, I've got 5 revolutionary metabolism busters to bust through the fat after 40.
He tells people to invest their money in everything from special powders to teas and extracts for their mega metabolism boosting capabilities. There are certain foods that'll boost your metabolism momentarily, like coffee or chili spices, but the change is so small that it would never have an impact on your waistline. We're talking less than half a calorie per minute for a short period of time. So Dr. Oz's metabolism boosters won't burn your fat, but they will burn your money. Number 2, Dr. Oz will often say that you can blast away your belly fat by going on a diet or taking supplements.
Add these to your diet to get rid of your belly once and for all.
And one thing I'll say really quick is that a lot of these supplements, especially like the detox teas that not only Dr. Oz but a lot of influencers hawk, are just laxatives. So if you're not familiar with what laxatives are, it just sends you to the bathroom real quick. Everything comes out real quick, right? And so A, it's not going to be permanent. B, what an unpleasant experience, right?
The truth is, there's just no evidence whatsoever to support this notion that targeted fat loss is possible. You just can't lose weight in one part of your body, no matter how appealing it sounds. Number 3, on almost every Oz show, he likes to claim certain supplements can help you lose weight.
Supplements. Those simple, safe, no prescription required pills and potions that can blast your fat, kill your cravings.
Garcinia cambogia, raspberry ketones, green coffee bean supplements. But most of these supplements have not been properly studied in people, and some have actually never been studied in humans. Or if they have, the studies are generally so small and flawed by design, there's no way to know whether they actually work. And let's face it, if there was a fat buster in a bottle, we wouldn't have an obesity problem. So when should you listen to Dr. Oz?
And so supplements in particular, if you're not familiar, the FDA does not regulate them because they're considered like non-food, non-drug substances. So if you go into like a GNC or a similar store, almost nothing in there has to have its claims even reviewed by the FDA. Okay, and like most of the time, it's gonna essentially be an elaborate placebo effect, no problem. But like when I was a high schooler in the 90s, people were taking these energy supplements that were making high school athletes have heart attacks, right? And it was being sold by places like GNC. So you have to be careful, right?
I'll let him explain.
What works for most people?
What works for most people is a diet based on real food, food that comes out of the ground, looking the way it looks when you eat it. It's not been processed, with some physical activity. Most of weight loss, I believe, is about the food choices you make. Most of keeping your weight low is about the physical activity you engage in.
So again, people will make these claims that are just rife with error, and sometimes they know, sometimes they don't. And it's actually problematic because like Dr. Oz is making money off some of these things. So, and this is to circle back around to our idea of type 1 and type 2 error and uncertainty in medicine. We know medicine isn't perfect. We know that we're still learning things every day. Within like, I want to say the past 3-4 years, there was a study that came out showing that there might be this organ in the body that we've never accounted for. It essentially like sits between our skin and our muscle. And the reason we never account for it is typically when we dissect things, right? They've been preserved in such a way that this collapses. And so like we're still discovering things about the human body. And so there can be false negatives, there can be false positives. Where it becomes especially problematic, right, is when the person knows this is probably not going to work, or it might only work for a few people, and I'm going to make money off of it because I can capitalize on people's fear of weight gain or being overweight that's rampant in our society. So again, type 1 error is when you think that a relationship exists and it doesn't. Right? So maybe you see 2 people walking down campus right over here and you're like, ooh, they must be dating. And you start to tell everybody, right? And like the rumor, I don't know if you, Wesley, and I'm guessing it's a lot like my small college. Like if you tell one person something, then like a friend of yours will come to you by lunchtime and be like, guess what I heard? Right? And it's like you didn't even know those 2 people knew each other. So again, type 1 error would be like telling this old man who, you know, we're going to assume he does not have a uterus, right, that he is pregnant. Type 2 error is where you think the relationship exists and it doesn't exist when it does, right? So again, maybe thinking someone is free and oops, they're in a relationship, right? So you're like flirting with someone and then you see them with their significant other and you're like, whoopsies, right? And so here we have someone who looks visibly pregnant and the person telling them, you're not pregnant, right? And so we want to be careful about both these types of errors because they're going to lead us to draw false conclusions. Alrighty. So that brings us to the end of the material for this exam. So I have the exam, I'll come pass it out. Folks who are on Zoom, what I'll do is I'll put some in the box of the office next to mine, and you can pick them up before you leave for fall break if you're going anywhere. And I'll just bring these around. Same format as last time, except this time it's legit 100 points, y'all. It's not 130. I double and triple check. But you're still gonna have extra credit on the front. You're gonna have your matching. And then you have your short answers based on a lot of the things we have done in class together. Once you get your exam, you're feeling free to look it over, see if you have any questions to ask me, and then you can head out. And I know some of you have more classes today, but if not, you can start enjoying your breaks. No.